I let my nephew keep the spare key to my house because he said it was safer that way. For 3 years, nothing happened. I paid my bills, watered my plants every morning at 6:30, and waved to the same neighbor walking her dog past my porch. Then, one Tuesday, I came home from the grocery store and noticed the hallway light was on. I don't remember turning it on. That was the day I realized everything I trusted was already being decided without me. I let my nephew keep the spare key because he said it was safer that way. That was the reason. Simple, sensible, the kind of decision people my age are encouraged to make, especially if we live alone. I was 68 then, still working part-time, still driving myself, still cooking my own meals. But everyone around me had started to use that tone, the careful one. So when Mark offered, I said yes. I slid the key across the kitchen counter, watched it disappear into his palm, and didn't feel a thing. For 3 years, nothing happened. My life stayed small and orderly. I woke up at 6:15 every morning, even on days I didn't work, because my body liked routine. I fed the cat, brewed coffee, stood at the sink while it dripped, and looked out at the back fence where the paint had started to peel. At 6:30, like clockwork, I watered the plants on the porch. At 7:10, the mail truck rolled past. At 7:15, Mrs. Callahan from 2 houses down walked her terrier, the leash always too long, the dog always stopping at the same patch of grass. We waved. We always waved. I taught bookkeeping at a community college twice a week and handled payroll for a small landscaping company the other days. Nothing glamorous. Numbers behaved themselves. They followed rules. If something didn't add up, it was because someone made a mistake, not because the math had feelings. I liked that. I liked knowing where things stood. Mark came by on Sundays sometimes. Not every Sunday. He was busy. He worked in property management and talked a lot about traffic and tenants and deadlines. He brought donuts once in a while, asked if the heater was working, reminded me to change the air filter. When he left, he locked the door carefully and told me to call if I needed anything. I told him I would. I meant it in the abstract, not as a plan. The first thing that didn't fit happened on a Tuesday in October. I remember because it was grocery day. I parked in the same spot at the store, second row from the entrance, bought the same things I always bought: milk, eggs, apples, cat food, bread. I was gone for 47 minutes. I know that because I checked the receipt later. When I came home, I carried the bags in 2 trips. On the second trip, I noticed the hallway light was on. It's a small thing, a bulb over a narrow stretch of carpet between the front door and the kitchen. I don't leave it on during the day. I never have. The house gets enough light, and electricity isn't free. I stood there with a bag of apples cutting into my fingers and looked at that yellow glow like it was a question someone had asked me quietly. I turned it off, put the groceries away, fed the cat, went on with my day. That night, I told myself I must have bumped the switch. Or maybe I'd turned it on out of habit and forgotten. I wasn't worried. I wasn't suspicious. I was just aware. Like when you hear a noise outside and pause before deciding it's the wind. A week later, I found a mug drying on the rack that I hadn't used. It was the blue one with the chip on the rim. I don't like it because the chip scrapes my lip. I keep it in the back of the cabinet for guests. I picked it up, turned it in my hand, and put it back where it belonged. I didn't mention it to anyone. Then the thermostat was set to 72 when I always kept it at 68. Then a stack of mail on the hall table was straightened, the envelopes lined up as if someone had squared the edges. Then a throw pillow on the couch was turned so the tag didn't show. None of it mattered. None of it proved anything. But together, they sat in my chest like a pebble in a shoe small, irritating, impossible to ignore once you noticed it. I didn't check the locks. I didn't change my routine. I didn't call Mark and ask if he'd been stopping by. The idea felt silly, intrusive. He had the key for emergencies, not inspections. And nothing was missing. Nothing was broken. The house didn't feel violated. It felt adjusted. The first time someone said it out loud, it wasn't Mark. It was a woman from the college named Denise. younger than me by at least 20 years, who taught the evening accounting class. We were standing by the copier, waiting for it to warm up. She asked how my week was going. I told her it was fine. She asked if I'd thought any more about next steps. I asked her what she meant. You know, she said, casual, like she was talking about lunch plans. Long-term stuff. It's good to have a plan, someone who can step in. I smiled and said I already did. I said my nephew helped me out when I needed it. I said it like it was a badge of responsibility. She nodded. That's great. It's such a relief when someone younger is keeping an eye on things. Keeping an eye on things. The phrase stuck with me. It sounded harmless, protective. It also sounded like something that didn't require my input. At home that evening, I opened the folder where I kept important papers, insurance, mortgage statements from years ago, my will. Everything was where it should be. The will named Mark as executor. I'd done that after my sister died. He was practical, organized. He'd offered without hesitation. I'd signed without much thought. At the time, it felt responsible. I closed the folder and put it back in the drawer. A few days later, Mark called and asked if he could stop by to check something in the basement. He said there'd been a water issue reported in a neighboring house, and he wanted to make sure my pipes were fine. He said it quickly, like it was already decided. I said, sure, of course, why wouldn't I? He came by on a Thursday afternoon while I was working from home. He went straight downstairs, didn't even take off his shoes. He was gone longer than I expected. When he came back up, he said everything looked fine. He asked if I'd thought about installing a smart thermostat. He said it would be easier, more efficient. He said he could set it up for me. I like the one I have, I said. He shrugged. Just a thought. Before he left, he asked if I was still driving at night. The question landed strangely. I told him yes. He nodded, like he was filing it away. That night, I lay in bed and listened to the house settle. The tick of the radiator, the soft thud of the cat jumping onto the dresser. I wasn't afraid. I was alert. There's a difference. Fear makes you imagine things. Alertness makes you notice what's already there. The next morning, I woke up to an email notification on my phone. It was from a company I didn't recognize, with a subject line that said, "Your account settings have been updated." I assumed it was spam. I deleted it without opening it. Then I hesitated, pulled it back from the trash, and opened it anyway. It referenced an address I recognized. My address. I told myself there had to be an explanation. There always is. I made coffee, fed the cat, watered the plants. At 6:30, Mrs. Callahan walked past with her terrier. We waved. By 7, the pebble in my shoe was no longer ignorable. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the important papers drawer pulled out beside me. The house was quiet in that way it gets right before something changes, even if you don't know yet what it's going to cost you. I told myself I was being dramatic. That was the word people like me reach for first. It's polite, it's efficient, it shuts things down before they turn uncomfortable. I had taught myself that habit over decades at work, in family conversations, in doctors' offices where concern was often mistaken for complaint, so I used it on myself. You're fine, I thought. You're noticing things because you're looking for them. I kept my routines exactly the same. I didn't want to give the day any excuse to feel different. I woke up at 6:15. Coffee, cat, porch plants. The radio stayed off. Silence felt easier to manage than voices. I left the house at the same time. Drove the same route. Parked in the same spot at work. At the college, nothing was wrong. My classroom smelled faintly of dry erase markers and old carpet. The students complained about deadlines and tuition and how everything cost more than it used to. I nodded at the right moments. I explained payroll deductions and withholding like I always had. Numbers still behaved. They still lined up when you asked them to. At lunch, Denise sat across from me with her salad and her phone. She asked if I'd thought about retiring fully. I said not yet. She said her parents were finally slowing down and how nice it was that they didn't have to worry about things anymore. I asked what things. She waved her fork vaguely. Bills, decisions, paperwork, all the stuff that gets tiring. It's a relief, she said, to let go. I smiled. I didn't argue. Arguing would have required explaining something I couldn't articulate yet. That evening, I came home and found the trash bin rolled back from the curb. I always did that myself, first thing after work. It was a small chore, but it was mine. I stood there for a moment, keys still in my hand, and tried to remember if I'd done it that morning. I couldn't. That bothered me more than the bin itself. Inside, the house smelled faintly like lemon cleaner, not strong, just enough to notice. I hadn't cleaned that day. I hadn't planned to. The counters were wiped down, the sink dry. It looked nice, taken care of. I told myself to be grateful. Mark called later that night. He asked how I was feeling. That was new. He didn't usually ask questions that broad. I said I was fine. He said good. He said he'd been thinking about me. He said it was probably time to get ahead of things. I won. What things? I asked. Oh, he said. Stuff that's easier to handle before it becomes a problem. He talked about neighbors of his clients who'd waited too long to make changes and how messy it got. He talked about paperwork piling up, accounts getting confusing, small mistakes turning into big ones. He spoke calmly, confidently, like someone explaining a process he understood well. You've done great, he said. I just don't want you to have to worry. I thanked him. That seemed like the appropriate response. After we hung up, I sat on the couch and stared at the turned pillow. I didn't move it back. Over the next week, little things kept resolving themselves without my involvement. A prescription refill I hadn't requested was ready at the pharmacy. A utility bill arrived already marked paid. A neighbor mentioned she'd seen Mark's car in my driveway and assumed I'd been out of town. Oh, no, I said. I was home. She shrugged. Well, someone was here. Unquote. I laughed it off. People misremember things all the time. At night, though, my sleep changed. Not badly, just lightly. I woke more easily. I noticed sounds. The click of the house settling, the hum of the refrigerator. Once, around 2 a.m., I thought I heard the front door open. I lay there, heart steady, listening. Nothing else happened. In the morning, the door was locked. I told myself dreams bleed into waking sometimes. On Friday, an envelope arrived from my bank. It wasn't unusual. Banks love paper. I opened it at the kitchen table while the coffee cooled. The letter thanked me for updating my preferences and confirmed that future correspondence would be sent electronically. I read it twice. I hadn't updated anything. I still liked paper. I liked filing it away, knowing where it lived. I logged into my account and checked the settings. The email address listed wasn't mine. It was Mark's. There was an option to change it back. I hovered over the mouse, then stopped. My hand felt heavy, like it didn't belong to me for a second. I closed the laptop instead. That night, I pulled the folder out again. Insurance, will, power of attorney. I hadn't looked closely at that document in years. I read it slowly, line by line. It granted Mark the authority to act on my behalf if I was deemed unable to manage my affairs. It didn't define who made that determination. It didn't require my approval once it was in effect. I sat there longer than I needed to. The words didn't accuse. They didn't threaten. They just existed. On Sunday, Mark came by unannounced. He said he was in the neighborhood. He brought a binder. He sat at my kitchen table and flipped it open like we were having a meeting. I've started organizing some things, he said, just to be proactive. Inside were copies of my bills, neatly tabbed, notes in the margins, a list of recommendations. He talked through them like it was helpful, like it was a gift. I listened. I nodded. I asked a few neutral questions. When he left, he took the binder with him. I'll keep this for now, he said, so it doesn't clutter your space. After the door closed, I stood in the kitchen and looked at the clean counters, the dry sink, the empty table. The house felt smaller, not in size, but in permission. Like there were fewer places I was allowed to touch without explanation. That evening, I called my sister's old number out of habit, then remembered she was gone. I didn't leave a message. I didn't call anyone else. Instead, I wrote down what I knew, not what I felt, not what I suspected, just what had changed. Dates, times, small facts, the hallway light, the email, the bin, the binder. Seeing it on paper didn't make it louder, it made it clearer. I wasn't being rushed. I wasn't being threatened. I was being managed. The realization settled quietly, not like panic, more like weight, the kind you don't notice until you try to stand up. That night, before bed, I moved the turned pillow back the way I liked it. It felt like a small rebellion. It also felt temporary. I lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how easily good intentions slid into decisions, and decisions into control. No one had raised their voice. No one had taken anything from me outright. Yet, somewhere between midnight and morning, I understood something I hadn't wanted to name before. The danger wasn't that someone meant to hurt me. The danger was that they were very sure they knew better than I did. And certainty, I was learning, could be just as invasive as cruelty when it came wrapped in concern. I didn't change what I did. I changed how closely I watched it. The days still unfolded the same way on the surface. Morning routines, work, groceries, dinner at home. But underneath, I started tracking patterns the way I used to track discrepancies in payroll reports. Not to accuse, just to understand. You don't jump to conclusions when numbers don't line up. You look for repetition. The first pattern was communication. Mark started looping himself into conversations that hadn't included him before. The pharmacy called to confirm a pickup authorized by your emergency contact. The electric company emailed him when a payment went through. A notice from the city about sidewalk repairs came addressed to both of us. His name printed neatly beneath mine, like it had always belonged there. When I asked how that happened, he didn't hesitate. I figured it'd be easier, he said, so nothing slips through the cracks. Cracks. Another word that sounded harmless until you realized it implied damage. The second pattern was language. He never said, "You should." He said, "We might want to." He didn't say, "I decided." He said, "It made sense." Everything was phrased as collaboration, but somehow the conclusion was always already reached. By the time I was informed, the discussion part was over. I started responding carefully, not evasively, just precisely. "That's interesting," I'd say, or "I'll think about it." Neutral phrases, placeholders. They bought me time without sounding resistant. The third pattern was timing. Things happened when I was busy, during class hours, while I was driving, when I was asleep, never during moments where I might interrupt or question them. Efficiency disguised as courtesy. One afternoon, I came home to find a new smoke detector installed in the hallway. It chirped softly when I walked past it. I stood on a chair and looked at the back. It was wired into the system, not the kind you buy at the hardware store and install yourself. Mark admitted he'd arranged it. "You didn't need to worry about that," I said. "I wasn't worried," he replied. "I was taking care of it." The phrase landed differently this time. I thanked him anyway. At work, I found myself double-checking my own memory more than usual. Did I already submit that report? Did I tell someone I'd be out next Friday? The doubt wasn't loud, but it was persistent. I recognized it for what it was: erosion. If you question yourself long enough, someone else will be happy to answer for you. One evening, while balancing the landscaping company's books, I noticed an error that didn't make sense. A transfer marked as authorized by me on a day I'd been teaching all afternoon. I pulled up my calendar. No gap, no phone call logged, no email. I corrected the entry and made a note. Not because the amount mattered, it was small, but because the process did. Someone had acted in my name without checking whether I was available to be consulted. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not from anxiety, from thinking. I thought about how often women my age were praised for being easy to work with, easygoing, not a burden. I thought about how that praise came with expectations, cooperation, gratitude, silence. I wondered when I'd agreed to be easy. The next morning, I made a list. Again, not of feelings, of instances. Who had access? Who had authority? Who had assumed permission instead of asking for it? I didn't confront Mark. Not yet. Confrontation would have made this about emotion. I needed it to stay about facts. On Thursday, I scheduled an appointment with my doctor for a routine checkup I didn't strictly need. I wanted something current on record, something objective. My blood pressure was normal, my memory intact, my reflexes sharp. She smiled and told me I was doing well for my age. For my age, I repeated. She laughed. Better than most. I walked out with paperwork in my bag and a sense of grounding I hadn't realized I'd lost. That afternoon, I stopped by the bank in person, not to change anything, just to ask questions. I spoke to a woman named Elaine, who had worked there long enough to recognize faces. She pulled up my account and asked if I wanted to review recent activity. Yes, I said. All of it. We went line by line. Most of it was familiar, some of it wasn't. I pointed out a setting change I hadn't requested. Elaine frowned slightly. That update came from an authorized contact, she said. Which contact? I asked. She read the name aloud. I nodded, as if that settled something. Inside, it did. Not emotionally, logistically. I thanked her and left everything as it was. Outside, I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. I watched people come and go. Older couples, young parents, a man helping his mother up the steps. Everyone looked like they belonged exactly where they were. I drove home and found Mark's car in my driveway. He was inside, standing in the living room, holding my mail. He smiled when he saw me. I was just sorting these, he said. Some of it looked important. I took the stack from his hands. I prefer to do that myself. End quote. He paused, just a beat, then nodded. Of course, he said. Habit. We stood there for a moment, the space between us filled with politeness. I realized then how much of this depended on me, not making it awkward, on me smoothing things over. I didn't. I need my key back, I said. The words surprised both of us. He didn't refuse. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he asked why. I'm reorganizing, I said. I'll let you know if I need it again. Dacked. He hesitated, then reached into his pocket and handed it over. The metal was warm from his body. I closed my fingers around it and felt something settle. After he left, I locked the door and placed the key in the drawer with the important papers. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steadier. That night, I went through my house room by room, not searching, inventorying what belonged to me, what decisions I still made without consulting anyone, where my name still meant my authority. I realized then that nothing had been taken yet. Not really. What had been tested was my willingness to notice. They weren't pushing hard. They were leaning, repeatedly, waiting to see if I would hold. I went to bed knowing something I hadn't known before. This wasn't about safety. It was about momentum. And momentum, once it carries you far enough, is hard to stop unless you plant your feet early. I turned off the light myself before sleeping. The hallway stayed dark. It came in a thin white envelope with the return address printed in block letters, the kind that looks official without trying too hard. I found it mixed in with grocery coupons and a flyer for roof repairs. Nothing about it suggested urgency. That, I would later understand, was the point. I opened it standing at the kitchen counter, tore it cleanly down the side, unfolded the letter once, then again. The first paragraph thanked me for my continued participation. The second confirmed a review. The third stated, in calm administrative language, that certain decisions could be expedited to reduce future complications. I read it 3 times before the sentence landed. A capacity assessment had been scheduled. Not requested, scheduled. The date was 2 weeks out. The location was a medical office I didn't recognize. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a note. Your authorized representative has been notified. I sat down. For a moment, my body reacted before my thoughts did. My hands felt cold. My jaw tightened. Not panic. Something closer to offense, like being spoken about while still in the room. I read the letter again, slower. There was no accusation in it, no suggestion that I'd done anything wrong. It framed the assessment as routine, proactive, beneficial. It used words like streamlined and supported and best interest, words that didn't require my agreement to proceed. I folded the letter and placed it carefully on the table. I didn't call Mark right away. I didn't call anyone. I made tea instead, waited for the kettle to click off, poured the water too hot, burned my tongue slightly. The sting was grounding. It reminded me I was here, present, aware. When Mark called later that afternoon, I answered on the third ring. I was just about to reach out, he said. You should be getting something in the mail. I did, I said. He exhaled, relieved. Good. I didn't want it to catch you off guard. It already had. He explained it the way people explain things they've already decided are settled. The assessment was standard. It didn't mean anything. It was just a box to check. It would make everything easier down the line. What line? I asked. The line where things get complicated, he said. I'm trying to prevent that. By deciding I can't, I said. He laughed softly, as if I'd made a joke. That's not what this is. Then, what is it? I asked. There was a pause, short, controlled. It's protection, he said. That was the word. The one people reach for when they want to close a discussion. I told him I needed time to think. He said, of course. He said, take all the time you need. The appointment was already set, but it could be rescheduled if necessary. He said that like it was generous. After we hung up, I sat very still. This was the moment the ground shifted, not because something had happened yet, but because it would, unless I intervened. Everything before this could be brushed off as help. As concern, this could not. This required my participation or my silence. Either way, it moved without me. I pulled out the folder again. The power of attorney, the signatures, mine, steady and confident from years ago. His. Beneath it, I traced the ink with my finger. I hadn't been tricked. That was the uncomfortable truth. I had agreed. I had trusted. I had believed that good intentions were enough to keep something from being misused. I spent that evening reading, not blogs, not advice columns, statutes, procedures. The language was dry, dense, unkind. It didn't care how I felt. It cared about thresholds, triggers, authority. The more I read, the clearer it became. This assessment wasn't about me failing. It was about efficiency, about making future decisions faster by removing friction. I slept badly that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind kept replaying the same thought. If I did nothing, this would look like cooperation. The next morning, I called the number on the letter. The woman who answered was polite, professional. She confirmed my name, my date of birth, the appointment time. When I asked who had requested the assessment, she answered without hesitation. Your authorized representative, she said. I asked what would happen if I declined. There was a pause. Not long, just enough to register. You're within your rights to do so, she said carefully, but we would document that choice. And then? I asked. She didn't answer directly. She explained next steps, reviews, recommendations, how these things tend to proceed. I thanked her and hung up. At work, I couldn't focus. Numbers blurred. Lines of data refused to stay where they belonged. I left early, told my supervisor I wasn't feeling well. That was true, just not in the way she assumed. I drove to the college parking lot and sat in my car instead of going home. I needed space, neutral ground, somewhere no one expected me to be. I thought about my sister, how quickly things had changed for her once doctors started using phrases like quality of life, how fast decisions moved once paperwork was in place, how little time there was to object once the machinery started. I realized then what the cost was. It wasn't losing my money, or my house, or even my independence in a practical sense. It was losing my voice at the exact moment it mattered most. By the time I drove home, I knew what I wasn't going to do. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to plead. I wasn't going to rely on Mark's interpretation of what was best for me. That evening, I drafted an email. I didn't send it. Not yet. I wanted it to sit overnight, to see if the words still held in the morning. They did. I requested documentation, written authorization, the exact scope of decisions being made on my behalf. I asked for timelines, for criteria, for justification. I asked as someone accustomed to audits, not as a woman asking permission. The response came faster than I expected. Mark called instead of writing back. "I think you're overthinking this," he said. "I think you're underestimating me," I replied. That stopped him. We didn't resolve anything on that call. We didn't need to. Something had already changed. The assumption that I would go along quietly had cracked. After we hung up, I walked through my house and turned on every light. Not because I needed them, because I could. I opened drawers, closed them, touched the things I'd chosen over decades, evidence of a life directed, not managed. I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote one more thing on my list. Inciting event identified. Once you name it, you can work around it, plan for it, prepare. The assessment was still scheduled. The machinery was still in motion, but now it was visible. And visibility, I was learning, was the first step in deciding whether something moved forward or stopped cold. I woke up before the alarm, the house still dark, the cat curled against my legs. For a moment, I lay there listening to my own breathing, steady, familiar. I wasn't rushing anymore. I wasn't reacting. I had crossed into a different phase, one I recognized from years of work, information gathering. When something didn't make sense in payroll, you didn't confront the system. You followed the trail, quietly, methodically. You let the facts line themselves up before you spoke. I got out of bed, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a legal pad. No calls, no emails, just me and the record. I started with dates. The hallway light, early October, the thermostat change. A few days later, the email notification. Mid-month, the bank setting update. The same week, the assessment letter. 2 weeks after that, it wasn't random. It wasn't emotional. It was procedural. I pulled up my calendar and overlaid it with my work schedule. Every change had happened when I was unavailable. Teaching, driving, sleeping. There was intention in that. Not malice, necessarily. Efficiency. Next, I looked at access. The spare key, the power of attorney, the emergency contact forms I'd filled out years ago and never revisited. Each one made sense on its own. Together, they formed a system that didn't require me anymore. That was the part that chilled me. Not fear, clarity. I opened a new folder on my computer and labeled it plainly, Personal Administration. Inside it, I saved copies of everything I could find. Bank statements, emails, letters, PDFs of forms I'd signed when my sister was still alive and I'd been tired and trusting. By mid-morning, I had a digital map of my own life that I hadn't realized I'd given away in pieces. I didn't call Mark. Instead, I drove to the public library. It felt almost absurd, walking past the rows of computers and quiet tables, but it was the one place no one would question my presence or my purpose. I signed into a workstation and spent 3 hours reading. Not advice, not opinions, policies, regulations, case summaries. I learned what capacity actually meant in practice, how loosely it was defined, how easily it could be framed. I learned how often assessments were requested not because someone had failed, but because someone else wanted to move faster. I printed what mattered, highlighted nothing. I didn't want emotion to creep into the margins. On the drive home, I stopped at the grocery store and bought the same things I always bought. Routine mattered. It anchored me. If I changed everything at once, it would look like panic. I wasn't panicking. At home, I found a voicemail from Mark. "Just checking in," he said. Let me know if you want to talk. I deleted it. That afternoon, I called my bank again. I asked to speak to someone in compliance, not customer service, compliance. The word carried weight. The man on the line was careful with his language. He confirmed what changes could and could not be made without my explicit approval. He explained thresholds, safeguards, limits. I listened, took notes, asked clarifying questions. Can I restrict third-party access temporarily? I asked. Yes, he said, as long as you are the primary account holder and competent. Competent. There it was. I scheduled an in-person appointment for the following week. Not urgent, just necessary. Next, I called the medical office listed on the assessment letter. I asked for their intake paperwork. They emailed it within the hour. It asked questions I hadn't been asked in years, about daily activities, finances, decision-making. It framed independence as a sliding scale, helpful, neutral, deceptive. I filled nothing out. Instead, I requested their policy on referrals. Who could initiate them? Under what circumstances? What documentation was required? The reply came the next day. Polite, vague, sufficiently revealing. A referral didn't require evidence, only concern. That was enough. I spent the evening organizing my files. Physical copies this time. I labeled folders, sorted chronologically. I made duplicates and stored them separately. Not to hide them, to protect them. As I worked, I noticed how calm I felt. Not detached, focused. This was familiar territory, the quiet before resolution. Late that night, I drafted a letter. Not to Mark, to myself. I wrote down what I wanted, in plain terms, not outcomes, principles. I wanted to retain decision-making authority, unless and until I clearly could not. I wanted transparency before action. I wanted assistance only when requested. I folded the letter and placed it in the folder with the power of attorney. A reminder of intent. The next morning, Mark showed up at my door. I hadn't invited him. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, expression carefully neutral. I didn't ask him in. We talked through the screen door. I'm concerned, he said. I know, I replied. You've been distant, he continued. You're making this harder than it needs to be. For whom? I asked. He blinked. For everyone. End quote. That's not my job, I said calmly. He shifted his weight. He was used to people yielding, to conversations ending when he said the right thing in the right tone. I'm trying to help you, he said. I don't need help right now, I said. I need space. He didn't like that. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flicked past me into the house. The assessment is still scheduled, he said. I think you should go. I won't, I said. The word landed cleanly. No explanation. No apology. He stared at me for a moment, recalculating. Then he nodded once. Let's talk about this later, he said. There is no later, I replied. There is now. He left without another word. After he was gone, I locked the door and sat at the kitchen table. My hands were steady, my heart rate normal. I wasn't proud. I wasn't angry. I was done pretending this was about misunderstanding. By the end of that day, I had done everything I could without escalating. I had information, documentation, options. The next step would change the tone of things. I knew that. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the email came through. Not from Mark, not from a doctor, from the county records office. The subject line was bland enough to be ignored if you weren't paying attention. Notice of file update. I almost deleted it. Instead, I opened it standing at the kitchen counter, one hand still resting on the edge of the sink. The message informed me that a document associated with my address had been accessed and reviewed. No changes made, just viewed. The timestamp was from the previous Friday, late afternoon. I had been in class at that hour. At the bottom was a reference number. I sat down and copied it onto my legal pad. This wasn't dramatic. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even hidden. That was what made it unmistakable. Someone had been checking to see what they could do next. I logged into the county portal using my own credentials. It took a few minutes to remember the password. I hadn't needed it in years. When the page loaded, my property record appeared the way it always had. Name, address, tax history, no liens, no changes, but there was a new entry in the activity log. Third-party inquiry recorded. No explanation. Just a date, a time, and a user category. Authorized representative. I didn't feel shock. I felt steadiness. The kind that comes when something finally matches what you already know. I printed the page. I didn't tell anyone. That evening, Mark called again. He asked how I was doing. He said he'd been thinking about our conversation. He said he wanted to make sure I wasn't feeling overwhelmed. I'm not, I said. That's good, he replied, because things tend to move faster once they start. The comment was casual, almost friendly. He wasn't threatening me. He was informing me. After we hung up, I went back to my files and added the printout to the folder. I labeled it simply, Property Activity. This was the first piece of evidence that didn't rely on interpretation. It wasn't about tone or language or assumptions. It was about action. Someone had looked. The next confirmation came 2 days later, from a different direction. I received a call from a woman at an insurance company I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. She asked to verify my coverage preferences. She used Mark's name without prompting. I didn't authorize any changes, I said. She apologized, said it was probably a misunderstanding, said she'd note the account. I asked what had triggered the call. There was an inquiry, she said. We follow up when representatives request clarification. I asked who had requested it. She answered. I thanked her and ended the call. By that afternoon, I had 3 independent confirmations of the same thing. Activity without consent. Not theft, not fraud. Preparation. This was the part most people missed, I realized. They waited for damage, for loss, for something dramatic enough to justify discomfort. But by then, the structure was already in place. I didn't want damage. I wanted leverage. I made another list. This one shorter. What could still be done without my approval? What could be slowed? What could be stopped entirely? The answers weren't comforting, but they were workable. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks. In the morning, I went to the bank in person. I brought nothing but my ID and my folder. Elaine recognized me and smiled. She asked how I'd been. I said fine. I asked for a private room. We sat across from each other at a small table. I laid out my documents one by one. I didn't accuse. I didn't dramatize. I asked questions. What protections are in place when an authorized representative acts without direct confirmation? I asked. She answered carefully. There were procedures. There were limits. There were notes on the account I wasn't aware of. Can those notes be reviewed? I asked. Yes, she said. By you. She pulled them up. They were neutral, professional, written as if they were observations, not plans. Client may benefit from additional oversight. Representative, proactive. Future changes anticipated. Anticipated by whom? I asked for a temporary restriction on third-party actions. Not permanent, just temporary. Elaine nodded and processed it without hesitation. It will notify the representative, she said. That's fine, I replied. On the drive home, I felt something close to relief. Not because things were over. Because they were visible. Mark called within an hour. You didn't tell me you were going to do that, he said. I didn't need to, I replied. His tone shifted, still controlled, less patient. This complicates things, he said. For you, I said. Yes, he exhaled sharply. I'm trying to avoid a situation where we're scrambling later. I repeated. There was silence on the line. You're reading too much into this, he said finally. No, I said. I'm reading exactly enough. That night, I pulled out the assessment paperwork again. I read the questions with new eyes, not as an evaluation of me, but as a tool to justify speed. I drafted a letter to the medical office. I declined the appointment, formally, in writing. I attached my doctor's recent evaluation. I requested that no further referrals be accepted without my direct consent. I sent it certified. That was the moment the tone changed. The next day, Mark showed up again. This time, he knocked harder. I didn't answer immediately. I finished what I was doing, then opened the door. "You're making this adversarial," he said. "I'm making it clear," I replied. He told me I was putting myself at risk. He said systems existed for a reason. He said I was being stubborn. I listened. Then I told him something I hadn't told anyone else. "I know you accessed my property record," I said. He froze. Just for a second. "It's public information," he said quickly. "Yes," I agreed. "But you didn't tell me." "That doesn't mean—" "It means you're planning," I said. Without me, the words hung there between us. He didn't deny it. Instead, he said, "Someone has to." That was it. Not concern, not protection, certainty. I nodded once. "Then you've misjudged the situation," I said. "Because I'm still here." He left without saying goodbye. I locked the door and leaned against it, not because I was weak, but because the moment deserved acknowledgement. This was the first time the truth had been spoken plainly. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table and reviewed everything I'd gathered. The evidence didn't accuse. It demonstrated. No one had tried to harm me. They had tried to bypass me. That was enough. I added a final note to my file. Confirmation achieved. The path forward wasn't emotional. It was logistical. The next steps would be deliberate, irreversible, and entirely within my rights, not the quiet of the house at night or the controlled quiet I had been cultivating for weeks, but a different kind, the kind that follows a sentence you can't take back. Someone has to. Mark's words stayed with me longer than I expected, not because they hurt, but because they clarified something I hadn't fully accepted yet. He didn't see me as temporary. He saw me as transitional. I spent the next few days doing very little outwardly. I went to work. I answered emails. I cooked dinner. From the outside, nothing had shifted. Inside, something fundamental had settled into place. I was no longer trying to preserve a relationship. I was deciding how much of it was real. On Thursday evening, I received a text from Mark asking if we could talk. Not about logistics, not about paperwork, just talk. I didn't respond right away. I let the phone sit on the counter while I washed dishes, dried them, put them away. I wanted to see how it felt to not rush. When I finally replied, I said yes. Saturday morning, at my house. I chose the time. I chose the place. He arrived on time. He always did. He stood in the doorway, waiting to be invited in. I stepped aside and let him enter, then closed the door behind him. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where he'd once laid out his binder like a plan. This time, there were no documents between us. He started by telling me he loved me, that he'd always looked out for me, that everything he'd done was meant to protect me. The words came easily. They'd been practiced. I let him finish. Then I asked one question. When did you stop thinking of me as the decision maker? He looked startled, not defensive, confused. I never did, he said. That's not an answer, I replied. It's a comfort phrase. He frowned. You're twisting this. No, I said calmly. I'm narrowing it. I listed facts, not accusations, dates, actions, things that had happened without my knowledge. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt him when he tried to interject. I waited, the way I did when students tried to talk their way out of errors that were already documented. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. You're focusing on the wrong things, he said. Intent matters. Intent explains, I said. It doesn't authorize. He rubbed his forehead, exasperated. You're making this personal. It is personal, I said. It's my life. That was when he said it. Not loudly, not cruelly, as if it were obvious. You're not seeing the full picture anymore. The sentence landed with a dull finality. It wasn't an insult. It was a conclusion he'd reached some time ago. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not break, release. That, I said quietly, is where we part ways. He stared at me, unsure whether I meant emotionally or procedurally. I'm not angry, I continued. And I'm not afraid, but I'm no longer negotiating my own existence. He tried to recover. He talked about responsibility, about family, about what people would think if things went wrong. He talked about my age without saying the number. He talked around me instead of to me. I listened until he finished. Then I stood up. This conversation is over, I said. And so is your authority to act on my behalf. He laughed, sharp and disbelieving. You can't just— I already have, I said. I didn't explain how. I didn't need to. The mechanisms were in motion. He didn't have to understand them yet. He left shortly after. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, just the sound of his car pulling away. I sat back down and noticed my hands were steady. That afternoon, I took a long walk through the neighborhood, past Mrs. Callahan and her terrier, past houses where people waved without knowing anything had changed. The world hadn't shifted, my place in it had. When I returned, there was a certified envelope waiting on the porch. I recognized the return address immediately. The medical office. Inside was confirmation of my cancellation. A note acknowledging receipt of my documentation. A sentence that mattered. No further action will be taken without direct patient request. I placed it in the folder. That evening, I made a call I'd been avoiding not out of fear, but because I needed to be sure. I spoke to an attorney whose name I'd gotten from the State Bar Referral Service. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't need to. I asked specific questions. She answered them without hesitation. Yes, she said. You can revoke it. Yes, she said. You should document that. Yes, she said. You're well within your rights. We scheduled an appointment for the following week. After I hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table and allowed myself one moment of grief. Not for Mark, for the version of the relationship I'd believed in, the one built on mutual respect instead of quiet replacement. It passed quickly. Later that night, I opened the drawer where I kept my spare keys. The one Mark had returned weeks earlier sat there, untouched. I removed it and placed it in a small envelope, sealed it, and wrote a date on the front. Not as evidence, as closure. I slept deeply. The next morning, I woke to sunlight instead of tension. The house felt like mine again, not because no one else could enter it, but because no one else was directing it. Over the next few days, messages came in. From Mark, from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, from someone at the bank asking to confirm a change. I responded only where necessary, briefly, clearly. I didn't explain myself to people who weren't listening. The final piece fell into place on Wednesday afternoon. I received confirmation that the power of attorney revocation had been filed, effective immediately. I held the paper in my hands longer than I needed to. This was the point of no return. Not because it escalated things, but because it ended ambiguity. I wasn't cutting ties. I wasn't punishing anyone. I was removing access. That distinction mattered. That night, I cooked dinner for one and ate it slowly. I turned on the hallway light, then turned it off again, just to confirm that I could. I smiled at the simplicity of it. Once the power of attorney was revoked, I didn't rush to tell anyone. I let the paperwork speak for itself. There is a difference between confrontation and consequence. I chose consequence. I spent the first morning after the revocation doing something deceptively simple. I made a list of every place my name appeared alongside someone else's authority. Not emotionally, administratively. Bank accounts, insurance policies, utility services, medical portals, emergency contacts, professional associations. Each item received the same treatment: verify, update, confirm. I worked in blocks of time, 90 minutes of calls, a break, another block. I kept my voice even. I didn't explain the history. I stated the present. Yes, I would say. I'm the primary holder. No, I would add. That access is no longer authorized. Yes. Immediately. Thank you. People responded well to certainty. It surprised me how little resistance there was once I stopped framing my requests as requests. By midday, I had closed 3 gaps I hadn't known existed. One involved an online portal I'd never used myself. Another involved a temporary designation that had quietly become default. The third was a shared calendar tied to my email account, full of reminders I hadn't set. I didn't delete anything. I exported records. I archived. I left trails intact. This wasn't about erasing the past. It was about reclaiming the present. That afternoon, I drove to the hardware store and bought a new set of locks. Not because Mark still had a key he didn't, but because I wanted a clean reset. The man at the counter offered to recommend an installer. I declined. I installed them myself. The process took longer than I expected. Screws stripped, a latch misaligned. I had to adjust the strike plate twice. When I finished, I tested the door several times, opening and closing it, listening for the solid click of finality. It sounded right. I kept the old locks in a box in the garage, not as evidence, as context. The next step was more delicate. I reviewed my will, not to rewrite it entirely, not yet, just to understand how it read now that the assumptions behind it had shifted. Language that once felt reassuring now felt vague. Provisions that once felt generous now felt presumptive. I highlighted nothing. I made notes in a separate notebook. Questions, options, scenarios. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I called a friend, not to vent, to inform. Susan and I had worked together long ago, before retirement schedules and grandchildren shifted priorities. She listened without interrupting. She didn't tell me what I should do. She asked what I wanted. I want to stay the author, I said. Not the appendix. She laughed softly. Then you're doing the right things. It was the only validation I needed. By the end of the week, the effects of my actions had begun to ripple outward. Mark called twice. I didn't answer. He emailed once, his tone careful, almost conciliatory. He said he wanted to make sure we were on the same page. I didn't respond. The page had been rewritten. He just hadn't read it yet. A cousin texted asking if everything was okay. I replied yes, because it was. At work, I noticed how little any of this bled into my professional life. Students still complained about deadlines, payroll still reconciled. The world didn't pause because I had drawn a boundary. That, too, was instructive. On Friday morning, I attended my appointment at the bank. Elaine walked me through the final confirmations. Restrictions in place, notifications sent, flags added. She looked up at me and smiled. You're very organized, she said. I've had practice, I replied. As I left, she added something quietly. A lot of people wait too long to do this. I know, I said. That afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table and reviewed my folder. It had grown thicker, not with drama, with documentation. Each page represented a decision made consciously instead of by default. I wasn't done, but I was no longer behind. The weekend passed without incident. No surprise visits, no urgent calls. The quiet felt earned. On Sunday evening, I cooked a meal that took time, chopped vegetables, simmered sauce, set the table properly, even though I was alone. Ritual matters when you're reclaiming something. After dinner, I took out the envelope containing the spare key Mark had returned. I didn't open it. I placed it in a larger folder labeled simply, closed. The word felt right. Late that night, I received one final message from Mark. It was short. I hope you know I was trying to help. I read it once. I didn't reply. Helping requires consent. Without it, help becomes control dressed in good manners. Before bed, I walked through the house and checked each door. Locked. Solid. I turned off the lights one by one. The hallway last. Darkness settled the way it always had. The call came on a Monday morning while I was at work. Mark's name lit up my phone, then disappeared when it went to voicemail. A minute later, my supervisor knocked lightly on my office door and told me there was a personal call waiting on the main line. That detail mattered. It meant Mark had already adjusted his approach. I excused myself and took the call in the small conference room at the end of the hall. "I didn't want to bother you," he said, as if that were true. "But I think we should clear the air," I agreed. Not because I owed him anything, but because this was the part of the process that required visibility. Boundaries that exist only in paperwork still need to be spoken aloud once. We met that evening at a coffee shop halfway between our houses. Neutral ground, public, familiar enough not to draw attention. He arrived early and stood when he saw me, the way people do when they want to signal respect they don't entirely feel. We ordered drinks, sat down. The table between us was small. He started by apologizing. Not fully. Carefully. He said he was sorry if I felt sidelined, sorry if things had moved too fast, sorry if his concern had come across the wrong way. Each sentence ended just before responsibility. I listened. I didn't interrupt. Then he asked, "Can we talk about what happens now?" That was the moment. "Yes," I said. "We can." I told him what I had done, not in detail, not defensively, just the facts. Access revoked. Authority clarified. Future decisions requiring my explicit consent. I didn't frame it as punishment. I framed it as structure. He frowned. "That feels extreme." "It's precise," I replied. He leaned back, crossed his arms. "You're acting like I was trying to take something from you." "You were," I said. "Time." He looked confused. "Time to decide," I continued. "Time to speak. Time to be consulted instead of informed." "That wasn't my intention," he said quickly. "I know," I said, "and that's the problem." He stared at me for a moment, then shook his head. "You're making this bigger than it is." "No," I said. "I'm seeing it clearly." The conversation slowed after that. He asked questions. I answered only the ones that mattered. He brought up family, history, everything he'd done for me over the years. I acknowledged it without letting it tip the scales. Gratitude does not require surrender. At one point, he said, "You have to understand how this looks. Why is it beres?" "I do," I replied, "and I'm comfortable with it." That unsettled him more than anger would have. People expect resistance to soften. They don't expect calm to hold. We finished our drinks in near silence. When we stood to leave, he hesitated. "I still want to be involved," he said. I nodded. "You can be." "Then why all this?" he asked, gesturing vaguely. "Because involvement isn't authority," I said, "and it never was." We walked out together, then parted ways in the parking lot. No scene, no final words. On the drive home, I noticed something unexpected. I wasn't replaying the conversation. I wasn't rehearsing alternate responses. It was done. The boundary had been spoken. That was enough. Over the next few days, the effects of that meeting made themselves known. A notification from my bank confirmed that inquiries from third parties were now being routed back to me. An email from my insurance provider asked me to verify updated contact preferences. A calendar reminder disappeared. Each change was small. Together, they marked a shift. Mark didn't call again. Not immediately. Instead, I received a message from my cousin asking if I was okay. The word was doing a lot of work. I replied that I was fine and asked how she was. The conversation moved on. At work, I gave a lecture on audit trails and internal controls. I heard my own voice explaining why systems fail when authority isn't clearly defined, and I almost laughed at the symmetry of it. That evening, I went through my house and noticed how still it felt. Not empty, settled, like furniture that had finally been placed where it belonged. 2 days later, Mark emailed. The tone was different this time, less certain. He asked if I would consider adding him back as an emergency contact, just in case. Number. I read the email twice, then replied with one sentence. "I'll let you know if that becomes necessary." He didn't respond. The quiet that followed wasn't punishment. It was recalibration. Systems adjusting to new parameters. On Friday night, I hosted a small dinner for myself. Nothing elaborate, a habit I'd picked up recently. Setting the table, eating without distractions, listening to the sounds of my own house. It reminded me that control doesn't have to be loud to be complete. The first sign came from the medical office. I received a voicemail asking me to confirm consent for a records transfer. The phrasing was careful, polite. I called back and declined. The woman on the phone thanked me and said she would note the file. Her tone carried a faint surprise, as if she wasn't used to patients answering their own calls. 2 days later, an email followed, asking again. This time, it included Mark on the CC line. I replied only to the sender. No consent granted. Please remove third parties from correspondence. Within an hour, the thread went quiet. It was a small thing, but it marked a change. Requests that once moved automatically were now stopping at me. That alone altered the pace of everything. At the bank, Elaine called to let me know an inquiry had been attempted and flagged. She asked if I wanted to review it. I said no. The review itself mattered less than the fact that it hadn't gone through. At work, my supervisor mentioned that someone had called asking about my schedule. She hadn't shared anything. She'd assumed it was a misunderstanding. I thanked her for checking first. You seem very organized lately, she said. I've had to be, I replied. That weekend, I noticed changes in my family's tone. A cousin sent a longer message than usual, filled with concern-shaped questions. Was I stressed? Had something happened? Did I need help with anything? I answered each question plainly. No, no, no. The absence of detail made people uncomfortable. I could feel it in the way conversations ended quickly, the way follow-ups didn't come. Mark stayed quiet. For a while, that worried me. Not because I feared him, but because silence can mean recalculation. I watched for signs, unexpected calls, indirect inquiries, anything that suggested escalation. Nothing came. Instead, there were adjustments. The landscaping company I worked with asked me to confirm that I was still the primary contact. Apparently, someone had inquired about changing payroll notifications. They hadn't gone through. I confirmed my role and thanked them for checking. That afternoon, I updated my resume. Not because I planned to leave my job, but because it felt prudent. Control extends beyond crisis. It includes options. I realized then that what I was experiencing wasn't retaliation. It was disruption. A plan that had depended on momentum was now stuck navigating checkpoints. On Tuesday, Mark finally reached out. Not directly, through an attorney. The letter was neutral, professional. It asked for clarification on the scope of changes I'd made and whether there was room for discussion. I read it twice, then placed it in the folder without responding. There was nothing to discuss. The following days brought more signs of adjustment. A utility company mailed a form requesting verification of account authority. I signed and returned it. A medical portal updated its security settings and prompted me to review permissions. I did. One by one, the loose ends tightened. I noticed how much of my life had been operating on trust rather than intention. Not because trust was wrong, but because it had been assumed to be sufficient forever. It isn't. On Thursday evening, I ran into Mrs. Callahan while taking out the trash. She asked if everything was all right. She'd noticed fewer cars in my driveway lately. Everything's fine, I said. She smiled. Good. You seem lighter. I laughed at that. Not because it was entirely true, but because it felt earned. Inside, I made a cup of tea and sat by the window. I watched the streetlights flicker on. The neighborhood looked the same as it always had. That was the strange part. From the outside, nothing had changed. From the inside, the architecture of my life had been restructured. Friday brought the most telling consequence. I received an automated notice that a file review request had been denied due to insufficient authorization. No names, no drama, just a closed loop. That was when it became clear. The system was no longer bending. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel victorious. I felt settled. There's a difference. That night, I slept without waking. No half dreams, no rehearsed conversations. The following week passed with little incident. Mark didn't call. The attorney didn't follow up. My phone stayed quiet. At work, I finished a project early and spent the extra time helping a student understand a discrepancy in her numbers. She thanked me and said she hoped to be as on top of things as I was someday. I smiled and told her it took practice. Part 10 wasn't about fallout. It was about recalibration, about watching a system adjust to the removal of an unspoken permission. People often think boundaries cause chaos. In my experience, they cause clarity. Those who benefit from ambiguity push back. Those who don't adjust. By the end of the week, the pushback had stopped. Not because everyone agreed with me, but because there was nothing left to exploit. I spent Sunday afternoon organizing my house, not in a frantic way, in a deliberate one. I donated clothes I no longer wore, shredded old documents, filed the rest. Each action felt like a vote cast in favor of order. That evening, I cooked a meal and ate it slowly. I didn't check my phone. I didn't anticipate interruptions. The consequences had arrived, and they were quieter than expected. Plans had dissolved. Assumptions had expired. Authority had returned to its proper place. I went to bed knowing that whatever came next would have to pass through me first. And that, I understood now, was the real shift. It came from Susan. She called on a Wednesday afternoon while I was reorganizing the hall closet, a task I'd been putting off for years. I answered with my shoulder pressed between the phone and my ear, a stack of old scarves in my hands. "I heard from someone today," she said, "and I think you should know." I stopped moving. She didn't rush. Susan never did. She had the kind of patience that comes from watching people make the same mistakes for decades and still believing they might choose differently the next time. "Mark spoke to an attorney I know," she continued. "Not recently, a while back, before any of this came to a head." I sat down on the floor. "What did he say?" I asked. "That he was scared," she said simply. The word landed differently than I expected. Not defensive, not explanatory, just factual. She told me what she'd been told, that Mark had watched his mother deteriorate quickly after a stroke, that decisions had been delayed because no one wanted to seem controlling, that by the time they acted, everything had already been decided by people who didn't know her, that he'd sworn he wouldn't let that happen again. "He wasn't planning to take anything from you," Susan said. "He was planning to be ready." Ready. The word echoed the way someone had echoed weeks earlier. It wasn't malicious. It was resolute. I thanked her for telling me and ended the call. I sat there on the floor for a long time, surrounded by old coats and dust and the faint smell of cedar. This was the part no one talks about, the moment when the story doesn't resolve into heroes and villains, but into people who acted out of fear instead of malice. It would have been easier if he'd been cruel. That evening, I pulled out the original power of attorney document again. I read it without anger this time. I noticed the date, the context, the fact that I'd signed it only months after my sister's death, when the idea of preparedness had felt comforting rather than invasive. I remembered Mark sitting across from me at this same kitchen table years ago, earnest and concerned, offering to help so I wouldn't have to think about things that scared me. I remembered how grateful I'd been then. None of that negated what he'd done recently, but it reframed it. He hadn't been trying to erase me. He'd been trying to outrun uncertainty. The difference mattered. The next morning, I received an email from Mark. The first one in weeks. It was shorter than I expected. "I owe you an apology," it began. He didn't justify. He didn't explain. He said he'd crossed lines, that he'd let his fear turn into certainty, that he hadn't realized how far he'd gone until the system pushed back. "I thought I was helping," he wrote. "I see now that I was deciding." I read the email twice. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. I replied later that day. "I believe you meant well," I wrote. "But intent doesn't replace consent. I needed you to stop. You did not. I didn't add forgiveness. I didn't add punishment. I ended with a boundary. I'm open to rebuilding trust," I wrote. "Slowly. With transparency, if that's something you want." I didn't know if he would, he replied the next day. He said yes. That was the twist I hadn't anticipated, not that he'd reveal a hidden scheme, but that he'd step back when confronted with the truth of what he'd become. It didn't absolve him. It didn't erase what I'd had to do to protect myself. But it changed the moral shape of the story. No one had been trying to harm me. They had been trying to manage fear by controlling outcomes, and I had refused to be the outcome. That afternoon, I walked through my house with a different awareness. The locks, the files, the systems I'd put in place weren't acts of defiance anymore. They were acts of authorship. I wasn't undoing what I'd done. I wasn't reopening access. I was choosing something more difficult. Coexistence without control. I called the attorney and asked a new question. Not how to sever ties, but how to structure collaboration without surrender. She answered thoughtfully. We talked about limited authority, defined triggers, sunset clauses, oversight, tools that assumed capacity instead of waiting for its absence. That evening, I cooked dinner and ate at the table instead of the couch. I set 2 place settings, then removed one, not ready yet. I slept deeply. In the morning, Mark texted asking if we could talk again. No agenda, no paperwork. Just coffee. I agreed. We met at the same cafe as before. This time, he didn't arrive early. He didn't stand when he saw me. He waited. We talked about his mother, about my sister, about the way fear makes people accelerate when slowing down would be safer. He listened more than he spoke. When he spoke, he asked instead of telling. At one point he said, I forgot you were still here. The honesty of it took my breath for a moment. I didn't, I replied. I had to remind you. We didn't resolve everything. We didn't need to. Some things aren't meant to be resolved. They're meant to be held carefully, with awareness, not to the way things were before those assumptions were gone, but to something quieter and more deliberate. A version of my life that moved at my pace, with my consent, and without needing to announce itself. In the weeks after that conversation with Mark, nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. No sudden gestures, no symbolic handovers, no declarations about trust restored or lessons learned. We spoke occasionally, short calls, clear topics. When something needed to be discussed, it was discussed before action, not after. When nothing needed attention, we let the silence stand. It felt unfamiliar at first. For years, attention had been confused with care. Silence had been confused with neglect. Now I was learning the difference. I met with the attorney one last time to finalize a structure that felt right. Not a blanket authority, not an emergency fantasy, something narrow, specific, conditional. It named scenarios instead of assuming decline. It required confirmation instead of prediction. It expired unless renewed. When I signed it, my hand didn't hesitate. The document didn't take anything from me. It reflected what I already knew, that autonomy doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes when no one insists on protecting it. At the bank, Elaine smiled when I told her everything was settled. You look lighter, she said. I'm steadier, I replied. The difference mattered. At work, I decided to reduce my hours, not because anyone suggested it, not because it was time, because I wanted to see what my days felt like when they opened instead of closing. I told my supervisor, who nodded and said she'd expected it eventually. Eventually, the word no longer sounded like a threat. With more time, I noticed things I'd missed before. The way the light shifted in the kitchen around mid-afternoon, the rhythm of the neighborhood when most people were gone, the satisfaction of finishing a book in the middle of the day instead of before bed. One morning, I rearranged the living room furniture, not drastically, just enough to change the flow. I moved the chair closer to the window. I turned the rug. I placed a small table where the light landed best. When I finished, I stood back and assessed it the way I always had, with a quiet, internal checklist. It felt right. Mark came by that Sunday afternoon, not unannounced. He knocked and waited. He brought coffee, not documents. We sat at the table and talked about nothing important. The weather, a neighbor's new fence, a movie he'd watched. Before he left, he paused near the door. "I'll follow your lead," he said, not as a promise, as an acknowledgement. "That's all I needed," I replied. After he was gone, I didn't analyze the interaction. I didn't catalog it for meaning. I let it be what it was, a moment that didn't require correction. Weeks passed, then months. The assessment appointment date came and went without incident. The systems I'd adjusted stayed in place. The files remained closed. The flags stayed flagged. Nothing tried to slip through. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about how close I'd come to letting the momentum carry me somewhere I hadn't chosen. Not because I was incapable, but because I was agreeable, because I'd been trained to see compliance as kindness. I no longer confused the two. One afternoon, while sorting old photos, I found a picture of myself from 10 years earlier. I was standing in front of this same house, smiling, keys in my hand. I looked confident, capable, present. I realized then that I hadn't become someone new through all of this. I had returned to someone I'd always been. I placed the photo in a frame and set it on the bookshelf, not as a reminder of what I'd survived, but of what I'd retained. On a quiet Tuesday morning, I woke at 6:15 out of habit. I made coffee, fed the cat, watered the plants at 6:30. Mrs. Callahan walked her terrier past the porch. We waved. The hallway light stayed off until I turned it on myself. Later that day, I wrote a short note and placed it in the folder with my most important documents. It wasn't legal. It wasn't binding. It was personal. If you are reading this and I am still able to speak, listen to me. I closed the folder and put it back in the drawer. That evening, I cooked dinner and ate slowly. I didn't rush. I didn't multitask. I let the day end the way it wanted to. Part 12 wasn't about triumph. It wasn't about reconciliation or distance or even justice. It was about dignity, the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't argue or perform or demand agreement. The kind that simply exists, intact, because someone chose to protect it before it was gone. I went to bed that night knowing that whatever came next, change, help, even decline, it would arrive on my terms. Not because I resisted care, but because I finally understood that care, without consent, is just another way of being erased. And I was done disappearing.